Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying tale, a quick question. Do you dare wear the fear? Our exclusive Shadows merch is here. Hoodies, tees, and more, designed for those who embrace the darkness. Get yours before they vanish forever. Link below. Part 1. Arrival. I never knew much about Uncle Elias. He was one of those family members who lingered in the background of my childhood memories. His presence felt more like a shadow than an actual person. He was the kind of man who didn't enjoy parties or social gatherings, preferring solitude to company. As a child, I'd heard the whispers from older relatives, those veiled mentions of how he was different. They said he spent his final years in a cabin deep in the Washington wilderness, living alone with only the trees and mountains for company. I never thought much about it. After all, what could I, a city-dwelling 20-something, possibly have in common with someone like him? When the news of his passing arrived, it was like an echo from the past, a family tragedy that no one was prepared for. I had only met him a handful of times in my life, each visit brief and distant, marked by an uncomfortable silence. I was shocked when my mother informed me that Uncle Elias had left me his cabin, an isolated structure deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. She hesitated as she told me, her voice thick with some emotion I couldn't quite place. He was different, she said, her eyes not meeting mine. Spent too much time alone near the end. Talked about something out there. Her words lingered in the air like smoke, and though I tried to press her for more details, she only shook her head, refusing to elaborate further. It was as if there was something too dark to speak of. Still, I accepted the inheritance. What was the worst that could happen? I thought. A small cabin in the woods sounded like the perfect escape from my hectic city life. And so, I packed my things and set out on the long drive, not knowing that my life would be forever altered by the time I returned. The journey was longer than I expected. The road started out paved, but quickly narrowed into a dirt path, winding through dense trees that seemed to close in around me. I passed few signs of human life. No houses, no other cars, just endless stretches of forest. It was the kind of landscape where the trees whispered secrets to each other, where the silence was almost too much to bear. By the time I arrived at the cabin, dusk had fallen. The sky was a deep shade of purple, and the forest was bathed in shadows. The cabin itself was older than I had imagined, weathered and beaten by years of isolation. The wood was darkened by age, the roof sagging in places, but it was solid. I could feel its presence before I even stepped inside, like a living thing that had been waiting for me. I entered cautiously, and the smell of old pine and damp earth filled my nose. There was an immediate heaviness to the air, a thick, oppressive feeling that seemed to press down on me from all sides. It wasn't the kind of heaviness you get from a closed, stagnant room. No, this felt more like the weight of the forest itself. Watching, waiting. The cabin's interior was bare, save for the furniture that had been left behind. A small kitchen table, a few chairs, an old wooden bookshelf filled with worn, leather-bound books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. But it wasn't the lack of decoration that unsettled me. It was the silence. It wasn't natural. It was too still, too perfect. No wind rustling the leaves outside. No distant calls of wildlife. Just silence. I tried to shake off the unease and made myself a quick dinner, though the food seemed tasteless. As night settled in, I found myself staring out the window at the vast expanse of trees beyond. The darkness beyond the glass was absolute, consuming. It felt as though something was waiting out there, just beyond my reach. When I finally retired to bed, I pulled the covers over my head, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched, but sleep didn't come easily. Instead, I lay there in the dark, listening to the eerie quiet of the forest outside. The air was heavy, thick with the presence of something I couldn't name. And then, in the early hours of the morning, I heard it, a thud, a deep, resonating sound that seemed to come from far off in the woods. It was the kind of sound that would normally go unnoticed, dismissed as the shifting of the forest itself. But this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more, a message, a warning. I tried to convince myself that it was just the forest settling, that I was overreacting. But as the night stretched on, I couldn't ignore the creeping sense of dread that had begun to settle into my bones. I had no idea then, but that was only the beginning. Part 2. The unsettling presence continued. The nights that followed were increasingly restless. I could feel the tension building with every passing hour, a creeping pressure that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. My nights were plagued with strange sounds, faint thuds in the distance, and sometimes a low growl that reverberated deep in my chest. It was impossible to discern where the sounds came from, as though they were coming from all directions at once. The knocking started again, more frequent this time. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the cabin walls. Never the door, never the windows, always the walls. Each time my heart would pound in my chest, and I would grab Uncle Elias's rifle, clutching it like a lifeline. I knew deep down that it was pointless. Whatever was out there had no fear of the rifle. It didn't need it. The knocks seemed to echo through the cabin, vibrating in the walls like a message, an invitation, or perhaps a warning. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to face it. I would go out there and see what it was that was tormenting me. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I knew that I couldn't keep hiding from whatever was out there. I waited until midnight, when the forest was at its most silent. The air was thick with the scent of pine and moss. I stood at the door of the cabin, rifle in hand, staring into the blackness beyond. Every part of me screamed to stay inside, to lock the door and wait for the sun to rise, but I pushed through it. I stepped out into the cold night air, my breath visible in the moonlight. For what felt like hours, I walked through the forest, the trees towering above me like dark giants. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. I could hear the distant sounds of the night, an owl, a rustling of leaves, but there was something else, something beneath those familiar noises. A heavy, deliberate footstep, a presence that lingered just out of sight. Suddenly, I froze. The silhouette of something tall and wide loomed between the trees. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light, but as I stared, the shape shifted, moving slowly from tree to tree. It was no longer a shadow. It was a figure, large, broad, and yet oddly still. I wasn't sure if it saw me, but it was aware of me. I could feel its gaze, cold and calculating. And then it did something that I'll never forget. It stepped forward, slowly but with purpose, and knelt by a large tree. I could hear the sound of its breath, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I instinctively raised the rifle. I wanted to pull the trigger to end this nightmare before it had the chance to get any closer, but my hand trembled. I couldn't shoot. Not yet. I wasn't sure what it was, or if it could even be killed. Then, without warning, it vanished into the trees. One moment it was there, looming large and terrifying, and the next it was gone, as though it had never been there at all. I stood frozen in place, unsure of what had just happened. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating. The forest felt alive, watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. I had no idea how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear. But eventually I turned and ran back to the cabin. My heart was racing, my mind swirling with confusion and terror. I slammed the door behind me, bolting it shut. The knocking started again, louder this time, as though it knew what I had seen. I stayed awake the rest of the night, the rifle still clutched in my hands. The night passed in tense, breathless silence, but as soon as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I knew it was time to leave. The cabin had become a prison, and whatever was out there in the woods had made it clear it wasn't going to let me go easily. Part 3. The encounter I thought I had escaped, but when I made it back to town, the sense of unease didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing I had seen in the forest was still watching me, still waiting for the right moment to make its move. I found a small motel in the nearby town and checked in under a false name. I needed distance, a sense of safety. I thought the town would offer me a respite, but it felt just as suffocating as the cabin. I didn't sleep for days. The images of that thing, the size, the eyes, the way it moved, haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face pressed against the glass. I heard its voice in my mind, distorted and garbled, whispering my name. A week passed in a blur of exhaustion and dread. I tried to go about my days, to put on a brave face, but every knock on the door, every creak of the motel floor sent my heart into overdrive. I couldn't relax. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being hunted. Then, one morning, I woke up to a sound I knew all too well. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. They echoed through the motel room, each one a reminder that whatever I had experienced in the woods wasn't over. But this time, it wasn't at the door. The knocks were coming from the closet. I lay still, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound. My mind raced, but I couldn't comprehend what was happening. How could it be here? How could it have found me? The knocks came again, louder this time, more insistent. My heart thundered in my chest, and I could feel the sweat pooling at the base of my neck. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape the terror that was closing in on me, but my body refused to obey. I stared at the closet door, my mind spinning with possibilities. I knew it was just a matter of time before it would come for me. It had followed me from the cabin, and now it was here, waiting. The knocking continued, relentless and marking, as though it knew I was paralyzed with fear. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Come out," it said, its voice low and guttural. "I'm waiting." The words sent a jolt of terror through me, and my entire body went cold. It knew my name, it knew where I was, and it wasn't finished with me yet. Part 4. The aftermath I left at dawn. I didn't pack. I didn't think. I just ran, leaving the cabin behind, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care where I went, just as long as it was away from that place. I drove as fast as I could, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles were white. I didn't stop until I reached the motel. It was a rundown place on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering in the early morning light. It was cheap, but that's all I could afford. I didn't care about anything except finding somewhere to hide. Somewhere far away from the woods, from the thing that had been waiting for me. The first few days I barely slept. I spent my time pacing the room, staring out the window as though I could outrun what had followed me. But I knew it wasn't over. It was never going to be over. A week later, I woke up to the sound of 3 slow, deliberate knocks, not at the door, not at the window, but from the outside wall of the room. The knocking continued, louder now. Each knock was an invitation, a summons. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't escape, not really. Whatever had followed me was here, and it wasn't leaving. Part 5. The unseen pursuer, the knock from outside, wasn't just a sound. It was a promise. The promise of something that had been following me since I set foot in those woods. I stayed perfectly still, not daring to move. My breath was shallow, and I could hear my heartbeat thudding in my ears, loud enough to drown out the sound of my thoughts. The knocks continued, 3, slow, deliberate. Then silence. I dared not open the door. I didn't want to see what was on the other side, but I also knew that if I didn't, the knocking might never stop. It felt like a challenge, a test, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what would happen if I failed. A cold sweat clung to my skin as I stood there, unmoving, eyes fixed on the door. My mind raced. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Maybe the stress from the past few days had finally gotten to me. Maybe this was the kind of breakdown people spoke about in hushed tones after surviving something traumatic. But deep down, I knew better. There was something out there, something that had been in those woods long before Uncle Elias, or anyone, had ever set foot on the land. I could feel it, like a presence hanging just on the edge of my consciousness. And now it was here, with me. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening, stretching across the walls. I stood there, paralyzed, until the morning light began to filter through the blinds. The knocks had stopped, but the oppressive air remained, heavy as ever. I had to leave the motel. I had to get away from this place, even though it felt like wherever I went, it would follow. There was no escape. Part 6. The return to the cabin. I didn't know where else to go. My mind screamed at me to leave town entirely, to find a place far away where the isolation of the woods wouldn't reach me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I ran, it would follow. It already had. It was in the motel, in the knocks, in the suffocating silence that refused to let go. I ended up back on the road, though I didn't know why. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I drove back toward the cabin, the place that had begun to feel like a twisted magnet, drawing me in even as it repelled me. I told myself I was only going to check on the place. Maybe make sure everything was still intact, or maybe just to see if the feeling would go away. But I knew better. It wasn't about the cabin anymore. It was about what was out there in the woods. Whatever had been watching me, whatever had been calling me from the moment I first stepped foot inside the cabin, it was waiting for me to return. When I arrived, the sun was setting, casting long, twisted shadows across the forest floor. The cabin looked as though it hadn't changed at all. It stood just as it had before, weathered and worn, but still strong. Despite the oppressive silence of the woods, I felt the tiniest bit of relief when I saw it, a semblance of familiarity in the heart of the unknown. But that sense of comfort didn't last long. The air was thick with something that felt like dread, a weight that pressed on me from every angle. The forest, which had once seemed quiet, now felt alive with an unseen presence. The trees loomed closer, their trunks thick with moss and age, their branches reaching out like long, skeletal hands. The very ground felt unstable, as though it were shifting beneath my feet. I stepped inside the cabin again, and the stale smell of pine and dampness hit me immediately. The walls seemed to breathe with the house, like it had somehow become a living thing, part of the forest itself. I didn't know how long I stood there, just staring at the familiar surroundings. The room felt claustrophobic now, the walls pressing in from all sides. Then I heard it, the knock. But this time it was louder, more insistent. It came from the wall, just as it had before. But now it was as if the walls themselves were vibrating with it. A low rumble, as though something massive, something heavy, was moving just beyond the structure. I froze. The floorboards beneath me creaked. I wasn't alone. I couldn't bring myself to move. There was a pull, like an invisible string tying me to the center of the room. My eyes darted to the windows, but they were too dark to see anything clearly. All I could hear was the soft, rhythmic thudding of the knocks, growing louder, reverberating through my bones. I grabbed the rifle and moved toward the door, my mind screaming at me to leave, to run. But something inside me wouldn't let go of the pull, the need to confront whatever this was. I stepped outside into the dark, the rifle heavy in my hands. The trees stood still, as if waiting for me to make the first move. The silence was deafening, and then in the distance I saw it. A figure, taller than a man, broader, its shape indistinct in the low light. It was waiting for me, just beyond the tree line, motionless. My heart raced and my breath came in ragged gasps. I wanted to call out. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, staring at the figure, knowing that whatever it was, it had been waiting for me, watching me. It had been here long before I ever set foot in this cursed place. The figure moved, slowly, methodically. I lifted the rifle, aiming it in the direction of the shape, but my hands were shaking so violently I couldn't keep the barrel steady. It was getting closer now, not walking, but moving through the trees with an unnatural grace, like a predator stalking its prey. Suddenly I heard a voice, a whisper, faint and guttural, carried on the wind. It was my name, but not the way I had heard it before. This time it was more than just a sound. It was a command, an invitation. I felt something shift in my chest, an overwhelming sense of dread, yes, but also a strange compulsion. It was calling me, pulling me toward it, and I couldn't stop myself. Without thinking, I took a step forward. Part 7. The descent. It was too late to turn back now. The world around me seemed to warp and distort as I moved toward the figure, the trees closing in around me like they were alive, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands ready to pull me into the darkness. The air grew colder, thicker, as if the very forest was exhaling something ancient and foul. My footsteps were muffled by the thick underbrush, but I could still hear the beat of my heart, loud and frantic. The figure loomed closer. It had no shape, no true form. It was a mass of darkness, something primal and malevolent, like a shadow that had been torn from the very fabric of the world. Its presence was suffocating, the air thick with its malevolence. And yet I couldn't stop myself. It was a pull, a force greater than anything I could resist. I stumbled through the forest, my vision blurring, the ground shifting beneath my feet. I could feel it now, its eyes on me, watching, waiting. Whatever it was feeding off my fear, and it only wanted more. I reached the clearing, and there it was, the thing that had been watching me all this time. It was a creature, but not in any way I had ever seen. It was larger than a man. its body covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was an unsettling mix of human and animal, its eyes black and unblinking, like pits of inky darkness. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth, and it spoke my name again. Only this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a growl, deep and guttural, shaking the very ground beneath me. I couldn't move. My mind was screaming for me to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. The thing took a step toward me. Part 8. The game it was playing with me. The creature had no interest in killing me, at least, not immediately. No, it wanted something more. It wanted me to understand. It wanted me to feel the terror, the dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach ever since I first stepped into this cursed place. It wanted to break me, to strip away whatever sanity I had left until all that remained was fear. And as I stood there, trembling, watching the creature take another step closer, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my life anymore. I was fighting for my soul. Part 9. The revelation the creature's eyes never left mine, its gaze as sharp and cold as ice. It was so close now, towering above me, its presence suffocating, pressing down on me like a physical weight. My heart hammered in my chest, the panic threatening to consume me entirely. The rifle, which had been my only sense of security, now felt like a useless extension of my trembling hands. I was no longer in control. I hadn't been for a long time. The air around me seemed to pulse with a strange, unnatural energy, thick with the stench of decay and the weight of something ancient. I had been pulled into this nightmare, willingly or not. The creature's slow, measured breaths echoed in my mind, each one like a countdown to something inevitable. And yet, I still stood there, unable to move, unable to scream, as if I were bound by some invisible force. It wasn't until it spoke again that I realized I had made a terrible mistake. "You shouldn't have come back," it growled, the sound deep and resonant, vibrating the very air. The words felt like a punishment, a harsh truth that I had known all along but refused to acknowledge. I wanted to ask what it meant, what it wanted from me, but the words lodged in my throat, caught between fear and disbelief. The creature took another step forward, and this time the ground beneath me trembled. The trees around us began to creak and sway, their branches twisting like grotesque fingers reaching toward the sky. The very forest itself was alive, its heart beating in sync with the creature's presence. It was no longer just a thing in the woods. It was the woods, the land, the ancient force that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The stories my mother had told me, the whispers about Uncle Elias, the strange things he had said before his death. The forest had always been there, yes, but it wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity. And whatever had been calling me here, whatever had been pulling me deeper into this nightmare, was part of it. The truth hit me like a hammer. This wasn't just some random creature I had stumbled upon. No, this was something older, far older than any human mind could comprehend. Something tied to the very land itself. And Uncle Elias, the man who had been obsessed with the forest, who had isolated himself for years, had known. He had known what lay in the woods, what it was, and he had become a part of it. He had left me the cabin not as a gift, but as a warning, a test. I was part of the ritual. I recoiled at the thought, but it made sense. The knocks, the whispers, the strange, unsettling presence that had followed me since my arrival. This wasn't just a chance encounter. It had been waiting for me all along, waiting for me to return to the place where it had once claimed its own, where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the ancient was paper-thin. The creature, this thing, stepped forward again, its massive form blocking out the sky. Its face twisted in something that resembled a grin, though it was anything but reassuring. It was the face of something that had no need for empathy, no need for understanding. It was a being that existed in the dark spaces between reality and nightmare, in a place where time itself didn't exist. "You were never meant to leave," it said, the voice so deep it reverberated through my bones. "The forest does not let go." I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I knew, deep down, that there was no escaping it. Not now. Not ever. The forest had claimed me long ago, and my return was simply the final chapter of a story that had been written long before I was born. The ground beneath my feet shifted, the earth trembling as if it were alive. I could hear the trees groaning, their trunks bending in unnatural ways, as if they too were being drawn into something far darker than I could comprehend. And then, as if to prove its dominance, the creature let out a deafening roar, the sound echoing through the clearing like a thunderclap. In that moment I understood. The forest was not just a place. It was a force, a living thing that existed outside the bounds of human understanding, and I was part of it now. Whether I wanted to be or not, I had become a part of the land, just as Uncle Elias had before me. And the narkings, the whispers, they were all a part of the ritual. A test, a call to see who would come, who would be drawn into the ancient web of fear and power that bound the forest together. And once you were in, you could never escape. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. Instead, I stepped forward, drawn into its gravity. The creature moved toward me, its presence a suffocating weight that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. This is it, I thought, as the creature loomed over me, its breath hot against my skin. This is the end, but I felt no pain, only darkness. Part 10. The cycle continues when I woke. It was morning, but it wasn't like any morning I had ever known. The light that filtered through the trees was harsh and unnatural, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to bend and stretch as if alive. The cabin stood before me, but it wasn't the cabin I had known. It was older, more worn, the wood bleached by years of weather and neglect. The door creaked open on its own, and I could feel the pull, like gravity itself was guiding me toward it. I didn't want to go in. I didn't want to face what was inside, but my feet moved of their own accord, taking me back through the threshold, back to the place I had once fled. As I stepped inside, the familiar smell of pine and damp earth hit me again. The cabin was still, silent, except for one thing. The knock, 3 slow, deliberate knocks against the wall. I had been here before, and I would be here again. Epilogue. The calling somewhere, deep within the forest, the creature waits. It watches, and it listens for the next call, the next person who will be drawn into the cycle of terror and madness. It is patient, it is timeless, and it is always hungry. You made it back for now, but the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now too. If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video, subscribe, but know this, some doors once opened do not close so easily.